Chapter 7, My Army Years. I graduated from Bowdoin in 1955 and received orders shortly thereafter to report for active duty at the Army's Transportation Corps Center at Fort Eustis, Virginia. While at Fort Eustis, I lived in the BOQ, Bachelor Officers' Quarters, and attended classes daily as part of TOBAC number 26, Transportation Officers Basic Course. I graduated 9th in a class of over 100. After graduation, we all anxiously awaited for our orders to be posted. Mine arrived, and I learned that I was assigned to Bassens, France. A search of an atlas, we didn't have the internet or Google yet, revealed that Bassens was a suburb of Bordeaux, known as the Petit Paris, in the southern part of France on the Garonne River. I had a brief furlough at home and then went to Fort Dix, New Jersey, awaiting detailed orders to France. I received them and learned I was to fly on a MATS, Military Air Transport System, flight to Frankfurt, Germany, and proceed by train to Bordeaux, France. I notified Diana, and she came to New York and stayed with Sharon Portman, who my brother Mickey was dating at the time and eventually married. My parents came to New York, and we all went out to a fine restaurant for my bon voyage dinner. Diana and I went back to Sharon's apartment and talked into the wee hours of the morning. It was a sad time for both of us as we realized we'd be apart for close to 2 years. I caught a bus back to Fort Dix at about 6 a.m. and by noon was packed and on an airplane for Germany. Upon arrival in Frankfurt, Germany, we were taken to a hotel near the train station where we were billeted until our orders came through, detailing how we were to go to Bassens, France. I felt very uncomfortable in Germany. It was only 10 years since the end of the war and the Holocaust, and signs everywhere in German, Herren und Damen, made me uneasy. I couldn't forget what these people had done to my Landsmen, and I was suspicious of everyone. My orders finally arrived, and I was happy to board an overnight train to Bordeaux and get out of what was left of the Third Reich. While in Germany, I learned that a second lieutenant from Eugene, Oregon, was also assigned to Bassens. We met. His name was Jim Roberts. We became lifelong friends. At the Bordeaux train station, we were met and escorted to Bassens, where we met our company commander, First Lieutenant Lee B. Filmon. He turned out to be a terrific guy. Camp Bassens was located across the Garonne River from Bordeaux, and Jim Roberts and I stayed in a small hotel in downtown Bordeaux. There were no BOQ accommodations at the base. The hotel where we lived was a family-operated inn-like place. We subsequently learned that it also served as a house of ill repute, but declined to partake of the professional services it offered. The hotel was located not far from the Bordeaux Opera House, a magnificent structure. I saw a show entitled Colorado. It was in French, of course, and was a poor version of the show Oklahoma. While living in Bordeaux, I drank my fair share of Vin Rouge Ordinaire. I'm sure that this partaking of cheap wine and the long nights filled with black coffee at Nodex operations, hear Nodex discussion shortly, contributed to my stomach problems later in life. My duties at Camp Bassens, the home of the 98th Transportation Company, were mess officer, TI&E, Troop Information and Education Officer, and Platoon Officer. There were 3 officers at Bassens, Lee Filmon, Jim Roberts, and myself. There were several non-coms, all of whom were characters and career soldiers who loved to booze it up. Sergeant Floyd was a physical education nut who led calisthenics every morning and did his one-hand push-ups while all the troops struggled with two-hand push-ups. Sergeant Clark was an excellent non-com when sober. Our first Sergeant Ellis was the guy who kept everyone in line and really ran the camp. Jim and I tired of the hotel and rented a small stucco house in Le Bouscat, a suburb of Bordeaux. We lived at 33 Rue de Pressance and bought a Simca automobile together as our mode of transportation to and from Bassens. I was wondering what the purpose of the 98th TC was when I learned of a field exercise in which we were an active participant. It was called NODEX for short, or New Over the Beach Discharge Exercise in full. The basic assumption behind the exercise was that the major French ports would be obliterated in an atomic first strike by the Soviets, and in order to supply our troops in Europe, we would have to bring in supplies over unimproved beaches with no harbors. Remember, this was 1956 and the height of the Cold War between the U.S. and USSR. The 98th was a railhead company. We received orders to proceed to a place near the French coast and set up a temporary tent city. We would do this, and the officers, the three of us, would live in a squad tent throughout the entire Nodex operation. It was in today's parlance, a 24/7 operation. Meanwhile, 3 ships loaded with actual supplies for our bases in ADSEC, Advanced Section in Europe, received orders diverting them from their original port destinations to a point off the French coast. As the ships headed for this coastal point, truck companies throughout Europe received orders directing them to that same point. Liaison was established with the local chef de gare, head of the rail station, closest to the coastal point where the ships were headed. Our bivouac area was always near the rail station and the coast. As the ships approached the coast and anchored off the unimproved coastline, their cargo was offloaded onto litterage and taken ashore, where it was stacked in a transit area on or near the beach. It was then loaded onto trucks, the ones that came from all over Europe, and transported to our railhead, where members of the 98th Railhead Company, my company, offloaded the cargo from the trucks into the rail cars. We had several stevedore gangs engaged in this arduously physically challenging task, and they performed extremely well. We worked around the clock in all kinds of weather. I often had the night shift and was the officer in charge of the entire railhead operation during my shift. My primary MOS, military occupation specialty, was 0804 or stevedore officer. I was responsible for assuring that the loaded cargo was properly blocked and braced so it wouldn't shift in transport. We had carloads of ammunition as well as pallets of sea rations which were being shipped to U.S. bases all over Europe. I was responsible also for assuring that the documentation was in order and the loaded freight cars were properly sealed and marked. It was quite a lot of responsibility for a 22-year-old to have, but that is what I was trained for. During my shift, I was literally responsible for millions of dollars worth of supplies being properly loaded into freight cars, properly documented, and sent to the proper destination in either COMZ, the communication zone, or ADSEC, the advanced bases, in the eastern part of Europe facing the Soviets and charged with stopping any aggression from them. This all happened during the height of the Cold War. While in France, I went on several Nodex operations and spent a great deal of time in the field. Being in the field was not fun. Our living conditions were minimal. During the rainy seasons, which seemed to be always, our feet would get wet and our clothes caked with mud. This led to a foot fungus infection, which I still have over 50 years later. Our dining facilities consisted of a field mess tent. Our latrine facilities consisted of temporary wooden stepped platforms with 50-gallon drums beneath the platform. Seats were cut into the platform upon which we sat to conduct our business. Privacy was unheard of. Powder was liberally spread around the seats to prevent the spread of crabs, which many of the troops acquired from the local entertainment. When the drums were half full, they would be removed by the latrine detail, and gasoline would be poured into them, and they would be set afire until only ashes remained. I participated in Nodex operations along the entire French coast. One operation was in Brittany near a town called Vannes. Another was near Saint-Nazaire. Another was in the south near Bayonne on the Bay of Biscayne. One was held in Soulac. I particularly recall a humorous incident that happened while we were stationed on a Nodex operation. We had a small one-holer latrine tent set up at the railhead. Near the tent, we had a huge pit excavated into which we threw trash from our operations. When the pit was almost full, we ignited it to burn the trash. On one particular day, while the latrine was in use, the trash exploded and spewed debris and sparks over the railhead and blew the latrine tent askew. Its occupant came running out with his trousers at half-mast and his face ashen. It was a hilarious sight. It turns out that an unexploded German 88mm shell left over from the war was at the bottom of our trash pit, and the heat from the fire detonated it. About halfway through my tour of duty, our base at Bassens was closed and we were moved to Périgueux. This was a delightful town in the heart of the Périgord region, and the food was superb. The onion soup at the local hotel was magnificent, and we ended most days in the garrison, sipping a Pernod and having soup d'onion. Jim Roberts and I shared a 2-room apartment in a private home on the outskirts of Périgueux. We sold our Simca and bought 2 flaming red Opels. In retrospect, it was amazing that in the nearly 2 years we shared living quarters and cars, Jim and I never had an argument. All the while in France, I kept up a running correspondence with Diana. We exchanged letters and tape recordings. I wrote some poetry and sent it to her occasionally. As a graduation gift, her father cashed in a bond he bought for Diana when she was a baby and sent her to France with 2 of her schoolmates and the mother of one who served ineffectively, it turned out, as a chaperone. Diana had an uncle who lived in Paris, and I contacted him and introduced myself by telephone. I took some time off as my leave had accrued, as I was saving it for when Diana came to France. Uncle Sam invited me to stay with him in Paris. I drove from Bordeaux to Paris and met Uncle Sam. I stayed at his apartment one night, and then we drove to Le Havre to await the arrival of the ocean liner Arosa Sun and Diana. It was a thrilling time greeting Diana after being apart for over a year and a half. We drove to Uncle Sam's apartment where Diana was staying while in Paris. I had rented a hotel room nearby. Diana and I went out on the town, spent some time in a passionate reunion at my hotel, and realized we were deeper in love than ever. Diana returned to Uncle Sam's apartment around 3 a.m. The next day, we made plans for Diana to meet up with Mrs. Bussard and the other girls with whom she was traveling. Diana and I were to tour for a week, and then Diana was to reunite with her group at Carcassonne at an agreed-upon time. We traveled to Périgueux, where I showed Diana where I lived and worked. We went to one of the Nodex sites. We traveled to Biarritz and Saint-Jean-de-Luz and drove through Spain down to Madrid. In Madrid, we stayed with some relatives of Uncle Sam by the name of Alvarado. The daughter, Cuca, who was about Diana's age, took us on a tour of Toledo and El Greco's studio. She pointed out an old synagogue and advised us that that was where Jews used to pray when they were in Spain. She had no clue that we were Jewish or what a Jew was. Cuca spoke no English, and we spoke no Spanish, but we managed to communicate in broken French. She was a practicing Catholic, and we did visit some magnificent churches. She genuflected and crossed herself as we entered. When Diana and I simply bowed our heads in respect, she must have assumed we were renegade Protestants. Much to her credit, she tolerated us and continued to be pleasant and friendly. Diana and I left Madrid and drove to Barcelona. We stayed at a hotel on the main street and were kept awake all night by roving, milling, celebrating throngs of people. From Barcelona, we drove over the Pyrenees toward Carcassonne and Diana's scheduled reunion with her travel mates. The road through the mountains was serpentine and dangerous, and we saw several herds of wild horses that we feared would run us off the road and into oblivion. They didn't, and we arrived safely in Carcassonne at the appointed time. Diana and I parted, and she continued touring with her friends, while I returned to army life and another Nodex operation. Mrs. Bussard had a close relative who lived in Zurich, Switzerland, and that was where Diana and her friends were going to stay after touring Italy and other cities. I still had some leave time left and made plans to reunite with Diana at Mrs. Bussard's relative's house. Her relative was Heinrich Potter, a renowned architect who lived in a beautiful home at 9 Klein Albus in Zurich. Mr. Patter treated us all to dinner shortly after my arrival there. I slept on a mattress on the floor at his house. The following day, Diana and I took off by ourselves for a 7-day tour. The girls with whom Diana traveled were green with envy. Mrs. Bussard looked disapprovingly at us, an unmarried couple preparing to spend another week together traveling. We drove through the Swiss Alps over the Susten Pass. It was magnificent. We picnicked on bread, cheese, and wine and camped out in a pup tent that I borrowed from the army. Although Diana had toured Italy with her friends, I had never been there, and we traveled along the eastern shore of Italy to Rimini, where we slept on the beach. We then traveled across Italy to Naples and Pompeii and climbed Mount Vesuvius. We drove north to Rome and visited the Vatican, St. Peter's, and many of the sites. We toured Venice and stayed at a pensione nearby. From Italy, we drove west through Monte Carlo and were singularly impressed with Princess Grace's castle and the gambling casinos. We stopped at a campsite along the Riviera and were kept up all night by a loud, snoring German camper. We arrived back at Périgueux, and Diana got on a train for Le Havre and her boat trip home with her friends whom she was meeting at the ship. Diana and I had pretty much agreed that we would marry sometime after my return from the Army when I got situated. At last, my orders came to travel back to the States. It was in late October 1957, and I was transported by ship on the USNS General Buckner from Bremerhaven. I was now a first lieutenant, and so I shared a stateroom with a major who was also returning to the States. The trip home in the North Atlantic was rough, and I recall the waves breaking over the deck at the bow of the ship. After several days at sea, we approached the coastal waters of the United States. As we moved slowly into the harbor, we could see the Statue of Liberty. It was a thrilling moment, and there wasn't a dry eye on the ship. There was a military band playing on the pier as we docked, and thousands of people were jammed along the wharf to greet us. I saw my dad and brother standing there and waving. It was a wonderful moment. I was glad to be back in the States and in the bosom of my family. My military serial number was 04051480. I was honorably discharged from the Army in November 1957 and placed on active reserve officer status